So today Father Michael has come to talk to us to tell us something about how monastic life started in the first place.
It seems clear that the early monks, and there were women as well, were inspired by the monastic or community traditions of the Old Testament. Many of them fled, as did Elijah, from unhappy situations and corruption, and they stayed in caves and solitary places. John the Baptist was also their inspiration, and indeed Christ himself in the desert. More importantly, some of the early monks regarded the brotherhoods of the prophets, especially under the direction of Elisha, who was a sort of abbot at the time, so it seems, saw them as the precursors, and they therefore were the followers of those interesting bands of prophetic brotherhoods who were wandering evangelists and intercessors, and as they went, they prayed aloud. Hence Saul joined the prophets. In the early centuries of the church, persecution drove out many Christians in flight, the fuga mundi, and many of them saw themselves as both refugees from the sinful society, where they were sometimes persecuted, and also making the positive step of deciding to give their life to the Lord in relative silence and peace. They went to considerable lengths to ensure that they received that, and if they couldn't find a cave, they built a pillar, as with the case of Simeon Stylites, on top of his pillar for over 30 years. Gradually the desert became, as it were, occupied by individuals, nearly always solitaries, self-organizing, and without necessary reference to other like-minded intercessors and hermits. But it became inevitable that, as the numbers grew, so some sort of community organization was going to be necessary, and the early hermits often arranged to meet once a week for the liturgy. They remained solitaries, but the beginnings of community life were there. It was not until the 3rd or late 2nd century that great leaders began to appear who, as it were, sponsored and directed the monks who came to them. Notable among them, of course, St. Anthony of Egypt, whose influence on the monastic structures was enormous, and he lived to be 100 or so. He was, of course, an inspiration and the beginning of those figures who directed the monks, and indeed some of the desert mothers, in the early church. Important especially was St. Pachomius, who seems to have been the first, so far as we know, who set about regularizing the group of monks who were, as it were, living nearby and who looked to him. And so there started the idea of a group living, perhaps rather loosely connected, in community with a senior superior, and of course having a rule. And I suppose in the 4th century we see the beginnings of several different attempts to regularize for posterity those living under a religious superior. The monastic movement received immense attention in the West, and it was really through St. Athanasius, exiled so often by the wicked empress, and he arrives in Rome for one of his longer exiles and spends a year there and has come fresh, as it were, fully informed from the desert, and the Pope asks him to write the life of Antony. And so the monastic movement swept into Europe, into the West, to a remarkable degree. At the same time, St. Basil and the Cappadocian Fathers were recognizing the validity of community living. They had experimented themselves. The Cappadocian Three were already living in community, and later on, St. Basil realized a rule should be drawn up for those who wanted to follow him. So we might say that by the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, a tradition of monastic life, harkening back to much earlier models in some cases, was already established in the Church. The rapid development, of course, in Western Christendom owes much to great founders before St. Benedict, of whom perhaps we might mention St. Martin of Tours, but there were others whose sheer personality and firmness and devotion enabled them to establish the monastic life. Nor should we forget the extraordinary significance of very early Celtic monasticism, for which we have archaeological evidence running back to the early Church. It would seem that their style of monasticism was so ancient that it was linked, perhaps, to the style of the desert. Great austerity, solitude, the eremitic life, and a sort of autonomy as well. On the island of Skellig Michael in the Atlantic, we see the monastic movement in these islands at its very infancy. It was later to be supplemented and transformed by the tradition of more moderated monastic life that came with Augustine of England and with the rule of St. Benedict. And so we are inheritors here in this land of a very rich tradition, both Eastern and Western, and we should remember that England became Christian and monastic at the same time when the monks from Rome came to evangelize our land. We are therefore able to make a certain unique claim to have a special charism to impart, and England is at heart deeply Benedictine and deeply Christian. Amen.
Thank you, Father Michael. I'm sure many people wouldn't have realised how far monastic life goes back, in fact more than 1,000 years before St. Benedict, who people often think of course, as the first of those monks in the West. So thank you for your superb summary, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again at some other time.